For 40 years, Frank Morrison had shared his morning coffee with Dakota, his faithful quarter horse, who knew every inch of their Wyoming ranch better than most people knew their own homes. The bond between a rancher and his horse runs deeper than words. It's built on trust, loyalty, and countless sunrises spent working the land together. So when Dakota started limping, Frank brushed it off. Horses get sore. They step wrong. It happens. But when Dakota collapsed 3 days later, trembling and unable to stand, Frank's world shifted. The emergency vet found something impossible, a tiny microchip embedded in Dakota's hoof, blinking with an encrypted signal. Someone had been watching. Someone had been tracking every move they made on land that had belonged to Frank's family for 3 generations. What kind of secret was buried beneath his ranch that was worth monitoring for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun painted the Bighorn Mountains in shades of amber and gold as Frank Morrison stood on his front porch, steam rising from his coffee mug in the crisp October air. At 62, his weathered hands told the story of 4 decades spent working this land, each callus and scar a testament to the honest labor that had built the Morrison Ranch from his grandfather's modest homestead into 3,000 acres of prime Wyoming cattle country. Dakota stood in the paddock nearest the house, his mahogany coat gleaming in the early light. The quarter horse had been Frank's constant companion for 15 years. Through drought seasons and harsh winters, through the good years when cattle prices soared, and the lean ones when every dollar counted. They understood each other in the way that comes only from shared purpose and mutual respect. Frank's wife, Margaret, emerged from the kitchen, her silver hair pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn for 35 years of marriage. She carried a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon, the same breakfast she'd made him every morning since their wedding day. "Dakota's favoring that left front leg again," she observed, settling into the wooden rocking chair beside him. Margaret had grown up on a ranch herself, the daughter of a horse trainer from Montana, and her eye for livestock was as sharp as Frank's own. "I noticed," Frank replied, cutting into his eggs. "Probably stepped in a prairie dog hole yesterday when we were checking the north fence. Nothing a few days of rest won't cure." But even as he spoke, Frank felt a nagging unease. Dakota had never been prone to injury. The horse possessed an almost supernatural awareness of the terrain, picking his way across rocky ground and through sagebrush with the sure-footed confidence of an animal born to this harsh landscape. In 15 years, Dakota had never taken a lame step. The ranch spread out before them like a living map of Frank's family history. His grandfather, William Morrison, had claimed this land in 1924, with nothing but a team of draft horses and an unshakable belief that hard work could transform the high desert into something productive. Frank's father, Robert, had expanded the operation during the prosperous years after World War II, adding the irrigated pastures along Willow Creek that now supported their prize. Angus cattle got Frank had inherited the ranch at 25 when a heart attack claimed his father, forcing him to abandon his plans for veterinary school and take up the mantle of responsibility that came with the Morrison name. He'd never regretted the choice. The land had a way of getting into a man's blood, of becoming as essential as breathing. Their closest neighbor was Tom Bradley, whose smaller spread bordered their eastern fence line. Tom's place ran mostly sheep, and though the two men maintained the cordial relationship expected of neighbors, there had always been an undercurrent of tension. Cattle ranchers and sheepmen had feuded in Wyoming since the territory's earliest days, and old habits died hard. The other significant presence in their valley was Dr. Sarah Chun, a veterinarian who had established her practice in the town of Willow Creek 5 years earlier. Fresh out of Colorado State University, She had initially faced skepticism from the old-timers who preferred the gruff, no-nonsense approach of Doc Henley, who had tended their animals for 40 years. But Dr. Chun's quiet competence and genuine love for animals had gradually won them over. Frank particularly appreciated her thorough approach to diagnosis and her willingness to explain her findings in terms a rancher could understand. Margaret finished her coffee and stood to collect the breakfast dishes. "I'm driving into town this morning to help set up for the church harvest festival," she said. "Want me to stop by Dr. Chun's office and ask her to take a look at Dakota?" Frank shook his head. "Let's give it another day or two. No sense troubling her over what's probably just a minor strain." As Margaret headed back inside, Frank walked down to the paddock where Dakota stood at the fence rail, his dark eyes alert and intelligent. The horse nickered softly Frank's approach, a sound of greeting that had remained unchanged through all their years together. Frank ran his hand along Dakota's neck, feeling the familiar warmth of the animal's coat, the solid muscle beneath. When he lifted Dakota's left front hoof, the horse shifted his weight obligingly, trusting Frank's examination completely. The hoof appeared normal. No visible stones or puncture wounds. No heat or swelling around the pastern or fetlock. "What's troubling you, old friend?" Frank murmured, his voice carrying the gentle tone he reserved for his horses. Dakota's ears swiveled toward the sound, and for a moment, Frank could have sworn he saw something like concern in the animal's expression. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of ranch work. Frank checked the water tanks in the east pasture, repaired a section of fence damaged by wind, and moved a small group of yearling steers to fresh grass. Dakota remained in the paddock, moving carefully but showing no signs of severe distress. By afternoon, Frank had convinced himself that Margaret was right to worry. The horse's gait had not improved, and if anything, the limp had become more pronounced. Dakota's usual enthusiasm for work had been replaced by a listless quality that Frank found deeply troubling. Frank's foreman, Miguel Santos, had worked the ranch for 20 years, arriving from Mexico as a young man with limited English but an intuitive understanding of cattle and horses. Now in his 40s, Miguel served as Frank's most trusted advisor, his judgment respected and his loyalty absolute. "El caballo está enfermo," Miguel said, joining Frank at the paddock fence. "The horse is sick." His weather-beaten face showed genuine concern as he watched Dakota's careful movements. "I'm thinking the same thing," Frank admitted. "This isn't just a stone bruise or pulled muscle. Something's wrong, but I can't put my finger on what." Miguel nodded slowly. "My grandfather used to say that horses know things we don't. They feel trouble in their bones before it shows itself to our eyes." Frank had heard similar folk wisdom throughout his life, stories of horses refusing to cross bridges that later collapsed, of animals growing restless before earthquakes or severe storms. He'd always attributed such tales to coincidence or the human tendency to find patterns where none existed. But watching Dakota now, he wondered if there might be more truth to the old stories than he'd ever imagined. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of two men in a dark SUV with government plates. They introduced themselves as Agent Marcus Webb and Agent Jennifer Cole from the Department of Agriculture, conducting what they described as a routine survey of livestock operations in the region. "We're updating our database on animal tracking systems," Agent Webb explained, his manner polite but oddly formal. He was a thin man in his 40s, with pale eyes and the kind of careful speech that suggested military training. "Some ranchers in neighboring counties have been participating in a voluntary monitoring program to help track disease patterns and migration routes." Frank found the explanation vaguely unsettling, though he couldn't articulate why. "I haven't heard of any monitoring program," he said. "And none of my animals are chipped or tagged beyond the standard ear tags required for sales." Agent Cole, a woman with short auburn hair and an equally professional demeanor, made notes on a tablet device. Of course, Mr. Morrison. We're simply gathering baseline information at this point. Would you mind if we took a brief look at your animals? It would help us understand the scope of our survey area. Something in her tone suggested that refusal was not really an option, though both agents maintained a facade of polite inquiry. Frank led them to the main corral where the breeding stock spent their days, pointing out the various bloodlines and genetic markers that defined his herd. Dakota watched the strangers from his paddock, his ears pinned back in an unusual display of hostility. The horse rarely showed aggression toward visitors, but today he seemed genuinely disturbed by the government agent's presence. "Beautiful animal," Agent Webb commented, approaching the paddock fence. "Quarter horse? 15 years old, sired by Doc Silver King out of a mare named Prairie Rose," Frank said with obvious pride. "Best cow horse I've ever owned." Agent Cole made more notes, her fingers moving rapidly across the tablet screen. Frank noticed that she seemed to be recording far more information than a simple livestock survey would require, including what appeared to be GPS coordinates and detailed descriptions of the ranch's layout. After the agents departed with promises to be in touch if their survey required additional information, Frank felt an odd sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Their visit had felt less like a routine government survey and more like reconnaissance, though he couldn't imagine what interest federal agents might have in his remote Wyoming ranch. That evening, as the sun set behind the Bighorn Mountains and the temperature dropped toward freezing, Frank made one final check on Dakota. The horse stood alone in the paddock, his head lowered and his breathing slightly labored. When Frank approached, Dakota didn't lift his head in greeting, an omission. That sent a chill down the rancher's spine. "Tomorrow we're calling Dr. Chun," Frank said aloud, though only Dakota was there to hear him. "Something's not right, and I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning." The wind picked up across the high plains, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and something else, a subtle tension that seemed to hang in the air like electricity before a storm. Frank pulled his jacket closer and headed back to the house, where Margaret waited with dinner and the comfortable familiarity of their shared life. But as he walked away from the paddock, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes were cataloging his every movement. The sensation was probably nothing more than imagination brought on by the strange visit from the government agents, but it lingered nonetheless, adding another layer of unease to his growing concerns about Dakota's mysterious ailment. Inside the house, the warmth and light provided temporary respite from his worries, but Frank's sleep that night was restless, filled with dreams of dark figures moving across his land and the sound of Dakota calling out in distress from somewhere far, beyond the reach of human help. Frank woke before dawn to the sound that every rancher dreads, the high, desperate whinnying of a horse in distress. He bolted upright in bed, his heart hammering as the cry echoed across the ranch yard. Beside him, Margaret stirred, her eyes immediately alert with the shared alarm that comes from decades of partnership in managing livestock. "Dakota," Frank said, already reaching for his clothes. The October morning air bit at his skin as he rushed from the house, his boots barely laced, Margaret close behind wrapped in a thick robe. The sound came again, a piercing wail that spoke of pain and fear in the universal language of suffering animals. Frank had heard similar cries during difficult births, severe injuries, colic episodes that could kill a horse within hours, but never from Dakota. The paddock lay in pre-dawn shadow, the mountains barely visible against the starlit sky. Dakota was down, his powerful body convulsing on the hard-packed earth, his legs thrashing in uncontrolled spasms. White foam flecked his muzzle, and his dark eyes rolled wildly, showing white crescents of terror. "My God," Margaret whispered, her hand clutching Frank's arm. Frank vaulted the fence rail with an agility that surprised him, dropping to his knees beside his stricken horse. Dakota's coat was slick with sweat, his breathing rapid and shallow. When Frank placed his hand on the animal's neck, he felt the racing pulse of a heart working too hard, the tremor of muscles locked in some kind of systemic crisis. "Easy, boy," Frank murmured, though his own voice shook with emotion. "I'm here. You're going to be all right." But even as he spoke the words, Frank knew they might be lies. He'd seen horses die from colic, from poisoning, from injuries that looked minor but proved fatal. Dakota's symptoms suggested something systemic and severe, the kind of crisis that could steal away a beloved animal before human help could intervene. Margaret had already run back to the house to call Dr. Chun's emergency line. In the growing light of dawn, Frank could see the full extent of Dakota's distress. The horse's left front leg, the one that had been bothering him, appeared swollen now, hot to the touch and clearly causing excruciating pain. Miguel appeared at the fence, having heard the commotion from the bunkhouse. His face went pale when he saw Dakota's condition. "¿Qué pasó?" "What happened?" "I don't know," Frank replied, his hands never stopping their gentle movement along Dakota's neck and shoulder. "He was fine last night. A little off, but nothing like this." Dr. Chun arrived within 30 minutes, her small SUV kicking up dust as she pulled into the ranch yard. She emerged carrying the black leather bag that held the tools of veterinary emergency care, her usually calm expression showing the urgency that a late-night call always brought. "When did this start?" she asked, climbing into the paddock without hesitation. 20 minutes ago. The screaming woke us up." Dr. Chun knelt beside Dakota, her trained hands immediately beginning their examination. She checked his vital signs, examined his eyes and gums, ran her fingers along his abdomen, listening for the sounds of normal digestion. Her face remained professionally neutral, but Frank caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested serious concern. "His heart rate is dangerously elevated," she said, preparing a syringe. "I'm going to give him something for the pain and to help calm the muscle spasms, but I need to get him to the clinic for x-rays and blood work." Frank felt his world tilting. In all his years of ranching, he'd lost animals to disease, accident, and the simple cruelties of nature. But the thought of losing Dakota felt different, personal, in a way that cut deeper than business concerns or even sentiment. Dakota wasn't just livestock, he was family. The drive to Dr. Chun's clinic in Willow Creek took 45 minutes. Dakota loaded in the horse trailer, with Margaret riding in the back to monitor his condition. Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white, while his mind raced through possibilities, each more dire than the last. The clinic occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, equipped with the kind of modern diagnostic equipment that would have seemed impossible when Frank was young. Dr. Chun worked with quiet efficiency, her technician helping to move Dakota into the examination area where the X-ray machine waited. I'm going to sedate him more heavily for this," she explained. "He's in too much distress for a proper examination, and I don't want him injuring himself further." As the sedative took effect, Dakota's violent thrashing subsided into a more peaceful stillness. Frank stood beside the examination table, his hand resting on his horse's neck, feeling the reassuring warmth of life beneath the smooth coat. Dr. Chun began with the injured leg, positioning the X-ray equipment with practiced precision. The first images appeared on her computer screen within minutes, revealing the intricate structure of bone, tendon, and soft tissue that allowed a 1,000-pound animal to move with such grace. "There," she said, pointing to a small bright spot near Dakota's hoof. "That's not bone or tissue." Frank leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the strange object that showed up clearly against the surrounding anatomy. "What is it?" Dr. Chun adjusted the image contrast, bringing the foreign object into sharper focus. It was small, roughly cylindrical, with what appeared to be electronic components visible within a protective casing. "It's some kind of implant," she said slowly. "Metallic, with internal circuitry. I've never seen anything like it in veterinary practice." Margaret moved closer to the screen, her face pale. "How did it get there?" "Someone put it there," Dr. Chun replied, her professional composure beginning to crack. "This was surgically implanted, probably under general anesthesia. The placement is too precise and the healing too complete for this to have been accidental." Frank felt the room spinning around him. "You're saying someone operated on my horse without my knowledge?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And based on the tissue response around the implant, this was done at least 6 months ago, possibly longer." The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. Someone had stolen his horse, performed surgery, and returned him without Frank ever knowing Dakota was missing. The level of planning and resources required for such an operation suggested something far more sophisticated than simple theft or vandalism. "Can you remove it?" Frank asked. Dr. Chun studied the X-ray images, her expression troubled. "The implant is positioned very close to major blood vessels and nerve pathways. Surgery would be extremely risky, and I'm not even sure what removing it might do to his condition. For all we know, the device is keeping him alive rather than making him sick." Frank's mind reeled with questions. Who would implant a tracking device in his horse? Why Dakota specifically? What were they monitoring? And for how long had his family's ranch been under surveillance? Margaret voiced the question that Frank couldn't bring himself to ask. "Is he going to die?" Dr. Chun administered another injection, this one designed to stabilize Dakota's condition. "I don't know. The device appears to be malfunctioning, sending some kind of electrical signal that's causing muscle spasms and neurological distress. If I can't find a way to block or disable the signal, the continuous stimulation could cause heart failure within days." Frank felt 30 years of suppressed emotion welling up in his throat. Dakota had been his partner through the hardest years of his life, the drought of '98 that nearly bankrupted the ranch, the long months when Margaret battled cancer and wasn't sure she'd see another Christmas. Through it all, Dakota had been there, steady and reliable, a living connection to the land that defined Frank's existence. "Do what you can," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. He's not just a horse." "Doctor." Chun nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further words. She'd grown up around animals, knew the bonds that could form between humans and the creatures that shared their lives. Dakota represented something irreplaceable, a connection to the past and a promise for the future that couldn't be measured in dollars or replacement value. As they prepared Dakota for an extended stay at the clinic, Frank's shock began transforming into something harder and more dangerous. Someone had violated his property, endangered his horse, and turned his peaceful ranch into a battleground in some conflict he didn't understand. The men in the government SUV suddenly took on new significance. Their polite questions about tracking systems and monitoring programs now seemed less like routine bureaucracy and more like reconnaissance. They had known about Dakota's implant, possibly even been responsible for it. Frank Morrison had spent his life avoiding conflict, focusing on the honest work of raising cattle and caring for the land. But as he watched his beloved horse struggling against the effects of technology that should never have been placed in a living creature, he felt something awakening in him that had nothing to do with peaceful ranching and everything to do with the protection of what he held dear. The drive back from Dr. Chen's clinic passed in heavy silence, the empty horse trailer rattling behind Frank's truck like a reminder of what had been lost. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally reaching over to touch his arm in the wordless comfort that decades of marriage had taught them both. Frank's mind churned with questions that seemed to multiply with each passing mile. The implant in Dakota's hoof represented a violation so profound that he struggled to comprehend its implications. Someone had not only stolen his horse, but had performed surgery on him, returning him to the ranch with electronic surveillance. Equipment hidden inside his body. The planning, the resources, the sheer audacity of it suggested an organization with capabilities far beyond anything Frank had imagined operating in rural Wyoming. As they turned into the ranch driveway, Frank noticed Miguel waiting by the main barn, his expression grim. The foreman approached the truck before Frank had even switched off the engine. "Patron," Miguel said, using the respectful Spanish term he reserved for serious conversations. "We have a problem." Frank climbed down from the truck, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders like a physical burden. "What now?" Miguel gestured toward the north pasture. "3 of the yearling steers are missing from the section we moved yesterday. No broken fences, no signs of struggle. They're just gone." Under normal circumstances, Frank would have assumed the animals had simply wandered through a gate. Someone forgot to latch or found a weak spot in the fence line that needed repair. Cattle were notorious escape artists, capable of finding the smallest opening and exploiting it with surprising intelligence. But today, with Dakota lying sedated at the veterinary clinic and the memory of government agents fresh in his mind, Frank found himself considering far more sinister possibilities. "Show me," he said. The 3 men walked across the ranch yard, toward the north pasture, Margaret choosing to accompany them rather than retreat to the familiar comfort of the house. The October morning had warmed slightly, but the wind carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, a reminder that the easy months were ending and the long test of Wyoming weather was about to begin. The pasture where the yearlings had been grazing showed no obvious signs of disturbance. The grass grew thick and green thanks to the irrigation system Frank's father had installed in the 1960s, and the water tank sat full and clean, its float valve working perfectly. But the 3 black Angus steers that should have been there were nowhere to be seen. Miguel led them to the fence line where the animals would most likely have made their exit if they had wandered away naturally. The 4-strand barbed wire stretched tight between metal posts, showing no breaks or repairs. The gates remained securely latched, their chains and locks showing no signs of tampering. "What do you think happened?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the controlled worry that Frank recognized from their early years of marriage, when every lost animal represented a significant financial blow. Frank studied the ground around the fence line, looking for the telltale signs that cattle would have left if they had been driven or led away. Hoof prints in the soft earth near the water tank showed normal grazing behavior, but beyond that, the trail seemed to disappear into the harder ground of the surrounding rangeland. "Miguel, saddle Ranger for me," Frank said, referring to the reliable bay gelding he used when Dakota wasn't available. "I want to ride the fence line and see if I can pick up their trail." As Miguel headed toward the barn, Frank's cell phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code indicated a local connection. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of authority that suggested government training. "This is Agent Webb. We met yesterday regarding the livestock survey." Frank felt his jaw tighten. "What can I do for you, Agent Webb?" "I understand you had some trouble with one of your animals this morning. A horse, I believe." The casual mention of Dakota's emergency sent a chill down Frank's spine. How could Agent Webb possibly know about Dakota's collapse unless he was monitoring the ranch in some way? Dr. Chun certainly hadn't contacted federal agents about a veterinary emergency, and Frank had told no one outside his immediate circle about the morning's crisis. "I'm not sure how that's any of your concern," Frank replied carefully. Agent Webb's tone remained pleasant but carried an underlying steel that Frank found deeply unsettling. "Mr. Morrison, I think it would be beneficial for all parties if we could arrange a meeting to discuss some matters of mutual interest." There are aspects of your situation that might be clearer with some additional context. What situation would that be? I think you know what I'm referring to, Mr. Morrison. Shall we say 2 o'clock this afternoon? There's a cafe in Willow Creek called Murphy's Place. We can have a private conversation there. Frank wanted to refuse, to tell Agent Webb exactly what he could do with his mysterious suggestions and veiled threats. But the missing cattle and Dakota's condition had left him feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since his father's. Death thrust him into ranch management decades earlier. If these people were responsible for what had happened to Dakota, he needed to understand their motivations and capabilities before he could figure out how to protect what remained of his world. 2 o'clock, Frank agreed. Excellent. And Mr. Morrison? It would be advisable to keep our conversation confidential for now. There are interests at stake that extend beyond your immediate concerns. The line went dead, leaving Frank staring at his phone with a mixture of anger and apprehension. Agent Webb's knowledge of Dakota's emergency, combined with his obvious expectation that Frank would comply with his request for a meeting, suggested a level of surveillance and control that Frank found deeply disturbing. Margaret had been listening to the conversation, her expression growing increasingly worried. Who was that? One of those government agents from yesterday. He wants to meet this afternoon. How did he know about Dakota? Frank shook his head. That's what I intend to find out. Miguel returned leading Ranger, the sturdy bay already saddled and ready for work. The horse snorted softly in the crisp air, his breath forming small clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the wind. Ranger was a good horse, dependable and sure-footed, but he lacked Dakota's intuitive understanding of cattle work and the almost telepathic communication that had developed between Frank and his primary mount over 15 years of partnership. Frank swung into the saddle, the familiar creak of leather and the solid warmth of the horse beneath him, providing momentary comfort in a world that seemed to be shifting around him like quicksand. He had ridden this land for 40 years, knew every draw and ridge, every seasonal creek and hidden valley. If the missing cattle were anywhere within reasonable distance, he would find them. The search took most of the morning, covering several square miles of rangeland that stretched from the ranch proper to the boundaries of national forest land. Frank found no trace of the 3 missing steers, no hoof prints or droppings that would indicate their passage, no signs of predator activity that might explain their disappearance. It was as if the animals had simply vanished from the earth, leaving no evidence of their fate. As he rode back toward the ranch buildings, Frank's unease deepened. The missing cattle, Dakota's implant, Agent Webb's mysterious phone call, taken individually. Each incident might have a reasonable explanation. Together, they formed a pattern that suggested forces at work beyond anything in Frank's experience. The Morrison Ranch had been his family's sanctuary for 3 generations, a place where hard work and honest dealing could build something lasting and worthwhile. Now it felt like a battlefield in some conflict he didn't understand, with his beloved animals serving as pawns in a game whose rules remained hidden from him. Murphy's Place occupied a corner building on Willow Creek's Main Street, its weathered brick facade and hand-painted sign marking it as one of the few establishments that predated the town's modest growth in the 1990s. Frank had eaten lunch there countless times over the years, usually in the company of other ranchers discussing cattle prices, weather patterns, and the small dramas that constituted news in rural Wyoming. Today, as he pushed through the glass door at 5 minutes past 2, the familiar environment felt foreign and potentially hostile. Agent Webb sat alone at a corner booth, his dark suit and city haircut marking him as clearly out of place among the collection of ranchers, truck drivers, and local business owners who made up Murphy's usual clientele. Frank ordered coffee from Ruby, the middle-aged waitress who had worked at Murphy's since Frank was in high school, then slid into the booth across from Agent Webb. Up close, the federal agent looked younger than Frank had initially estimated. probably in his late 30s, with the kind of lean build that suggested regular exercise and careful attention to physical fitness. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Morrison," Agent Webb said, his voice carrying the same professional courtesy that had characterized their previous encounters. "I know this situation must be confusing for you." Frank wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, using the warmth to steady himself. "Confusing doesn't begin to cover it. What I want to know is how you knew about my horse this morning, and why you think it's any of your business." Agent Webb glanced around the cafe, confirming that their conversation couldn't be overheard from neighboring tables. "Mr. Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified information that could have serious implications for national security if it were to become public knowledge. I need your word that you'll keep this conversation confidential. I'm not promising anything until I understand what's going on." Agent Webb nodded as if he had expected such a response. "Fair enough. Let me start with some background that might help you understand the bigger picture." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder, placing it on the table between them. "Your ranch sits on top of what we believe to be a significant mineral deposit. Not oil or gas, but rare earth elements that are critical to advanced electronics and defense applications. Elements that are currently controlled almost exclusively by foreign powers, who may not always have America's best interests at heart." Frank felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. "If you're here to tell me that the government wants to seize my land for some mining operation, you can save your breath. My family has owned this property for 3 generations, and no federal agency is going to take it away from us. No one wants to take your land, Mr. Morrison. Quite the opposite. We need your cooperation to protect what may be one of the most strategically important mineral deposits in North America." Agent Webb opened the folder, revealing geological survey maps, mineral analysis reports, and satellite photographs that showed Frank's ranch from various angles and elevations. The level of detail was staggering, including topographical features that Frank hadn't noticed, despite 4 decades of working the land. These surveys were conducted over the past 18 months using advanced remote sensing technology. The results indicate rare earth concentrations that could supply American defense contractors for decades, reducing our dependence on potentially hostile foreign sources. Frank studied the maps, recognizing the familiar contours of his property rendered in scientific precision. "What does any of this have to do with my horse?" The monitoring device in Dakota was part of a broader surveillance system designed to track animal behavior patterns over the mineral deposit. "We've learned that certain animals show behavioral changes when exposed to low-level electromagnetic fields generated by underground rare earth formations. Your horse was selected because his daily movement patterns covered the most geologically significant areas of your ranch." The explanation struck Frank like a physical blow. Dakota hadn't been randomly selected for some cruel experiment. He had been chosen specifically because his work routine made him an ideal monitoring device for geological surveillance. "You people performed surgery on my horse without my knowledge or consent for the purpose of geological exploration." Frank's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Agent Webb lean back slightly. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your anger. The operation was conducted by specialists while Dakota was temporarily relocated for what you believed was standard veterinary care. He was returned to you within 72 hours with no lasting effects from the procedure." Frank's mind raced back through the previous year, searching for any period when Dakota had been away from the ranch long enough for major surgery. The only possibility was the previous spring when Dr. Chun had recommended Dakota receive vaccination updates and dental work that required general anesthesia. Frank had left Dakota at the clinic for 3 days, trusting Dr. Chun's professional judgment about the need for extended recovery time. Dr. Chun was part of this? Agent Webb shook his head. Dr. Chun believed she was treating Dakota for a standard Medical condition. The surgical team worked during off hours when the clinic was closed. Dr. Chen's records show only the procedures she actually performed. The revelation that Dakota's surgery had occurred literally under Dr. Chen's nose, without her knowledge or consent, added another layer of sophistication to the operation that Frank found deeply disturbing. These weren't amateur conspirators working with limited resources. They were professionals with the kind of access and capabilities that suggested federal involvement at the highest levels. "Why are you telling me this now?" Agent Webb's expression grew grave. "Because the monitoring device is malfunctioning, potentially fatally. Our technical specialists indicate that the electromagnetic interference is causing the neurological symptoms you observed this morning. Without intervention, Dakota will likely die within the next 72 hours. Frank felt the world tilt around him. "You're saying that your surveillance equipment is killing my horse?" "I'm saying that we need to work together to save him. Our specialists have developed a protocol that should neutralize the malfunctioning device without requiring invasive surgery. But we need access to Dakota and your cooperation in implementing the treatment." Frank's hands clenched into fists on the table. "And if I refuse?" Agent Webb's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine regret. "Then Dakota dies, and we lose 18 months of critical data about the mineral deposit. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved." The implicit threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a dangerous fire. Frank understood now that he wasn't being offered a choice. He was being presented with the illusion of choice, while the real decisions were made by people whose names he would never know. "What about the missing cattle? A precautionary relocation?" "They'll be returned to your ranch within 48 hours, unharmed and with no lasting effects from their temporary absence." Frank pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. "I need time to think about this." Agent Webb nodded, closing the folder and returning it to his jacket. "Of course. But remember, Mr. Morrison time is something Dakota doesn't have much of. Every hour we delay increases the risk of permanent damage." As Frank stood to leave, Agent Webb added one final comment. "There's one more thing you should know. This conversation never happened. If you attempt to contact media outlets, other government agencies, or anyone else about what we've discussed, you'll find that there's no official record of our investigation, no documentation of the geological surveys, and no evidence that any federal agents have visited your ranch. Dakota's condition will be attributed to natural causes, and your family's ownership of the ranch may come under review for tax irregularities that my colleagues in other departments might discover." The message was clear: comply or face consequences. That extended far beyond Dakota's welfare. Frank had encountered government bureaucracy before, usually in the form of agricultural inspectors or tax assessors, but never anything that carried the implicit threat of total destruction of everything he had built. Frank walked out of Murphy's place into the afternoon sunlight, but the warmth couldn't penetrate the cold that had settled into his bones. The world he had known for 62 years, a world where hard work and honest dealing were enough to protect what a man valued, had revealed itself to be an illusion maintained by people who operated according to rules he was only beginning to understand. The drive back to the ranch gave Frank time to process the magnitude of what Agent Webb had revealed. The familiar landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains now carried a different significance, transformed from the pastoral beauty he had always known into a potential battlefield over resources he hadn't even known existed beneath his feet. Margaret was waiting on the front porch when he pulled into the driveway, her expression showing the kind of worried anticipation that 40 years of marriage had taught her to recognize in herself. She didn't ask questions immediately, understanding that Frank needed time to organize his thoughts before he could share what he had learned. They sat together on the porch swing that Frank's father had built in 1968. watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the ranch yard. The familiar creaking of the chains and the solid warmth of Margaret's presence beside him provided an anchor point in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath his feet. "They want our land," Frank said finally. Margaret's hand found her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones in a gesture of support that needed no words. "For what?" Frank told her everything: the rare earth minerals, the surveillance operation, Dakota's role as an unwitting monitoring device, the missing cattle, and Agent Webb's thinly veiled threats. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "What are we going to do?" she asked when he finished. Frank had been asking himself the same question during the entire drive home. The options seemed limited and fraught with danger. Compliance would save Dakota's life, but would essentially turn their ranch into a government research facility. Resistance might trigger the kind of bureaucratic warfare that could destroy everything they had built over 3 generations. "I need to talk to someone who understands how these people operate," Frank said. "Someone who knows the system from the inside." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "What about your cousin Jack?" Frank's cousin, Jack Morrison, had followed a different path than the family tradition of ranching, joining the Army after high school and eventually working his way up through the ranks to become a colonel in military intelligence. He had retired 5 years earlier, but maintained connections throughout the defense and intelligence communities. If anyone could provide insight into Agent Webb's operation and its legal standing, it would be Jack. That evening, Frank placed a call to Jack's home in Colorado Springs. The conversation required careful phrasing, given Agent Webb's warnings about confidentiality, but Jack's military background allowed him to read between the lines and understand that Frank was dealing with a situation involving federal agencies and classified activities. "Without knowing the specific details, I can tell you that geological surveys for strategic minerals are a legitimate government function," Jack said. "But the methods you're describing sound like they go well beyond normal protocols. Most surveillance operations require extensive legal justification and oversight. What if they're operating without proper authorization?" Jack's pause suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Frank, if federal agents are conducting unauthorized surveillance on American citizens, that's a serious matter. But proving it would require evidence that these people are very good at making disappear. You'd be going up against professionals who have resources you can't imagine. So what would you do?" "I'd document everything, create multiple copies of any evidence, and find a way to get that information to people who have the authority to investigate federal overreach. But I'd also be very careful about who I trusted and how I went about it." After the call ended, Frank sat in his study surrounded by 3 generations of ranch records, financial documents, and family photographs. The walls held reminders of simpler times, pictures of his grandfather's first cattle drive, his father's expansion of the irrigation system, Frank's own proudest moments as a young rancher, building something lasting from the Wyoming soil. Now, all of it felt threatened by forces he barely understood. The rare earth minerals beneath his land represented wealth beyond anything his family had ever imagined. But they also attracted the attention of people who operated according to rules that had nothing to do with property rights or constitutional protections. Margaret brought him coffee and sat in the leather chair across from his desk. "Have you decided what to tell Agent Webb?" Frank shook his head. "Every auction feels like a trap. If I cooperate, we become complicit in whatever they're really doing here. If I resist, they have the power to destroy us financially and probably legally as well. What about Dakota?" The question cut to the heart of Frank's dilemma. Every hour they delayed increased the risk that the malfunctioning device would kill his beloved horse. But accepting Agent Webb's help would essentially surrender any remaining independence Frank had in determining what happened on his own land. Margaret seemed to understand his internal struggle. You know what your grandfather would have done." Frank smiled despite his worry. William Morrison had been a man of absolute principles, the kind of person who would have faced down federal agents with the same determination he had shown in battling drought, disease, and economic hardship. But William Morrison had lived in a simpler time, when government overreach was more obvious, and the tools available to federal agencies were far less sophisticated. "Grandpa never had to deal with anything like this," Frank said. "The worst government interference he faced was agricultural inspectors and tax collectors. These people have capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction to his generation." "But the principles are the same," Margaret replied. "Either you own your land or you don't. Either you have rights that can't be violated or you don't." Frank knew she was right, but the practical reality of their situation made such clear-cut moral choices nearly impossible. Agent Webb and his colleagues held most of the advantages: legal authority, technological capabilities, financial resources, and the kind of institutional backing that could overwhelm any individual's resistance. The sound of a vehicle approaching the house interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Frank could see the headlights of Miguel's pickup truck coming up the driveway. The foreman normally left for his own small house several miles away before sunset, so his return suggested something requiring immediate attention. Miguel knocked on the front door, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Patron, you need to see something." Frank and Margaret followed Miguel across the ranch yard toward the main barn. The October night was clear and cold, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. As they approached the barn, Frank could see light spilling from the open doors and hear the sound of vehicles running. Inside the barn, two black SUVs sat with their engines idling, their license plates obscured by mud. Agent Webb stood near the vehicles, talking quietly with Agent Cole and two other men Frank didn't recognize. All four were dressed in dark clothing and carried equipment that looked more military than civilian. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Frank demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man defending his own land. Agent Webb turned toward him with an expression of mild annoyance, as if Frank's presence was an inconvenience rather than a right. "Mr. Morrison, we tried to reach you by phone, but you didn't answer. Dakota's condition has deteriorated more rapidly than our projections indicated. We need to implement the treatment protocol immediately." Frank felt his world spinning out of control. These people had invaded his ranch, occupied his barn, and were now demanding access to his horse without his consent. The illusion of choice that Agent Webb had maintained during their afternoon meeting had completely disappeared, replaced by the reality of superior force and institutional authority. "Get off my land," Frank said quietly. Agent Webb's expression didn't change. "Mr. Morrison, we both know that's not going to happen. The question is whether you want to cooperate in saving Dakota's life, or whether you prefer to force us to take more direct action." Frank stood in his own barn facing armed federal agents who had invaded his property without warning or legal justification, and felt the full weight of how powerless an individual citizen could become when confronting institutional authority. The familiar smell of hay and leather, the comforting presence of his horses in their stalls, the tools and equipment that represented 40 years of honest work, all of it had been transformed into a stage for a confrontation he never could have imagined. "You have no legal authority to be here," Frank said, though he knew the words carried little weight against the reality of superior force. Agent Webb reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "Actually, we do. This is a warrant issued under the Defense Production Act, authorizing emergency access to strategic mineral resources and related infrastructure. Your ranch qualifies as critical infrastructure, Mr. Morrison." Frank took the document, recognizing the official seals and legal language, even as he struggled to understand. how his family's cattle ranch had become redefined as a matter of national security. The warrant was signed by a federal judge he'd never heard of and referenced statutes that seemed designed to circumvent normal constitutional protections. Margaret moved closer to his side, her presence a reminder that this violation affected not just Frank, but everyone who called the ranch home. What happens to us? Agent Cole, who had remained silent during the previous confrontations, stepped forward with what might have been genuine sympathy in her expression. Mrs. Morrison, no one wants to displace you or interfere with your normal operations. We simply need periodic access to conduct geological surveys and monitor environmental conditions related to the mineral deposit. By implanting surveillance devices in our animals, that was a temporary measure that won't be repeated. We've developed less invasive monitoring methods that will accomplish the same objectives. Frank felt trapped between his desire to protect Dakota and his growing understanding that cooperation would only lead to deeper involvement in activities he fundamentally opposed. Every concession would be followed by new demands. Every compromise would establish precedent for further violations of his family's rights. I want to see Dakota, Frank said. Agent Webb nodded toward one of the other men, who Frank now realized was carrying a large metallic case that probably contained the equipment needed to address Dakota's condition. Dr. Morrison will accompany U.S. to the veterinary clinic. The treatment will take approximately 2 hours, after which Dakota should make a complete recovery. The title doctor suggested that at least one of these people had legitimate medical credentials, though Frank doubted that veterinary medicine was his primary specialty. The sophisticated equipment and coordinated approach indicated resources that went far beyond anything normally available to agricultural researchers. The drive to Dr. Chen's clinic took place in a convoy of 3 vehicles. Frank and Margaret in their truck, followed by the 2 government SUVs. Frank used the time to call Dr. Chen and inform her that they were bringing Dakota back for emergency treatment, though he couldn't explain the full circumstances without violating Agent Webb's confidentiality requirements. Dr. Chen was waiting. When they arrived, her expression showing concern for Dakota mixed with confusion about the nature of the emergency treatment. Frank could see her struggling to understand why federal agents would be involved in treating a horse's medical condition, but professional courtesy prevented her from asking direct questions. Dakota lay in the same examination room where the microchip had been discovered that morning, his condition visibly worse than when Frank had last seen him. The horse's breathing was labored, his coat dull with fever sweat, and his eyes held the glazed look of an animal in systemic distress. Dr. Morrison, if that was his real name, opened his equipment case to reveal electronic devices that looked more appropriate for a military field hospital than a rural veterinary clinic. Frank watched as the man connected sensors to Dakota's body and began monitoring readouts on a tablet computer. The electromagnetic interference is causing cascading neurological failure, Dr. Morrison explained to Dr. Chen, speaking in the kind of technical language that established his credentials while revealing nothing about the true nature of the situation. I'm going to use a targeted electromagnetic pulse to reset the malfunctioning circuit. Dr. Chen frowned at the explanation. I've never heard of electromagnetic pulse therapy for neurological conditions in horses. It's an experimental treatment still in clinical trials. But given the severity of Dakota's condition, conventional approaches aren't likely to be effective. Frank knew he was witnessing a carefully orchestrated deception designed to provide cover for an operation that had nothing to do with legitimate veterinary medicine. Dr. Chen's genuine concern for Dakota was being manipulated to provide professional credibility for a procedure that would erase evidence of federal surveillance. The treatment itself took less than 30 minutes. Dr. Morrison attached additional devices to Dakota's body, entered commands into his tablet computer, and activated what appeared to be a controlled electromagnetic field generator. Dakota's body went rigid for several seconds, then relaxed as if a terrible tension had been released. Within minutes, the horse's breathing became more regular, his eyes cleared, and he attempted to lift his head in response to Frank's voice. The transformation was dramatic and undeniably real, whatever its underlying cause. "The interference has been neutralized," Dr. Morrison announced. "Dakota should make a complete recovery within 24 hours. Dr. Chun performed her own examination, checking Dakota's vital signs and neurological responses. Her expression showed amazement at the rapid improvement, though Frank could see her professional skepticism about the treatment methods that had produced such results. "This is remarkable," she said. "I've never seen a recovery this rapid from neurological symptoms this severe." Agent Webb began packing the electronic equipment, his manner suggesting that their business at the clinic was concluded. "Dr. Chun, we'll need you to maintain confidentiality about tonight's treatment. The electromagnetic pulse therapy is part of a classified research program that could be compromised if details became public." Frank watched Dr. Chun struggle with the ethical implications of the request. As a veterinarian, she had professional obligations to share medical knowledge that could benefit other animals. But the implied authority of federal agents conducting classified research created conflicts she was clearly unprepared to navigate. "I'll need to document the treatment in Dakota's medical records," she said finally. Agent Webb nodded. "Of course. But please limit your documentation to the essential facts: neurological symptoms, experimental electromagnetic therapy, complete recovery. Any additional details could jeopardize ongoing research that may eventually benefit veterinary medicine." More broadly, as they prepared to transport Dakota back to the ranch, Frank realized that he had witnessed something far more sophisticated than a simple cover-up. These people had not only removed evidence of their surveillance operation, but had done so in a way that created a plausible medical explanation for Dakota's crisis and recovery. Dr. Chun would remember treating a horse with mysterious neurological symptoms that responded to experimental electromagnetic therapy, a core story that contained enough truth to be believable while concealing the real nature of what had occurred. The ride home took place in thoughtful silence, Dakota stable and the horse trailer and Frank's mind churning with the implications of what he had witnessed. Agent Webb's operation represented a level of planning and coordination that suggested resources far beyond anything Frank had imagined possible in rural Wyoming. 3 days after Dakota's recovery, Frank thought the worst might be behind them. The horse had returned to normal behavior, showing no lingering effects from either the malfunctioning device or the electromagnetic treatment. The missing cattle had been returned as promised, appearing in the north pasture with no explanation, but also no apparent harm. Agent Webb and his team had departed with assurances that future monitoring would be conducted through less intrusive methods. Frank was beginning to allow himself the hope that his family's life might return to some semblance of normalcy when Miguel approached him with a discovery that changed everything. "Patron, you need to see what I found in the old mine shaft." Frank looked up from the fence repair he was working on, his hands still gripping the wire stretchers. The old mine shaft Miguel referenced was a remnant from the 1890s, when his great-grandfather had briefly attempted silver mining before concluding that cattle offered better prospects than hard rock extraction. The shaft had been sealed with concrete and steel grating decades earlier, both for safety reasons and to prevent curious children or livestock from falling into the abandoned workings. "What were you doing up there?" Miguel's expression carried a troubled quality that Frank had learned to take seriously. "Looking for the source of that weird humming sound. You know, the one we've been hearing at night for the past few weeks." Frank did know the sound Miguel was referring to, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from the direction of the foothills, barely audible but persistent enough to be noticed during the quiet hours after sunset. Frank had attributed it to military aircraft from the airbase 60 miles to the south, or perhaps industrial equipment from the gas drilling operations in the next county. They drove Miguel's pickup truck up the winding dirt road that led to the old mine site, the vehicle bouncing over ruts and rocks that hadn't seen maintenance since Frank's father abandoned the mining claims 40 years earlier. The October afternoon was warm for the season, with the kind of clear Wyoming sky that stretched endlessly toward horizons defined by distant mountain ranges. The mine entrance sat in a natural depression, carved into the hillside by his great-grandfathers. Determination and primitive equipment. The concrete seal that had protected the shaft for decades remained intact, but something had changed. The steel grating that covered the opening showed signs of recent disturbance, fresh scratches on the metal, new bolt holes drilled into the concrete, and a sophisticated electronic lock where the old padlock used to hang. "This wasn't here last month," Miguel said, pointing to the electronic lock. "And look at this." Miguel led Frank around the side of the hillside to a location that should have been solid rock and native vegetation. Instead, they found a carefully concealed entrance that had been cut into the stone with precision equipment, disguised with artificial rock facing that matched the surrounding geology almost perfectly. Frank knelt beside the hidden entrance, running his fingers along the seam, where artificial materials met natural stone. The workmanship was extraordinary, the kind of sophisticated camouflage that would be invisible to casual observation, but revealed its artificial nature under close examination. "How did you find this? The humming is loudest here. And last night, I saw lights moving around inside." Frank felt his chest tighten with a familiar dread. Agent Webb's assurances about minimally intrusive monitoring were beginning to look like another layer of deception, an operation that seemed to grow more complex with each revelation. The concealed entrance was secured with the same type of electronic lock that protected the main shaft. But Miguel had discovered something else, a ventilation grate, hidden among the natural rock formations that allowed air to circulate through whatever facility had been constructed inside the mountain. As they examined the ventilation system, Frank heard the sound of approaching vehicles from the direction of the ranch. Through the scattered pine trees, he could see a convoy of trucks climbing the mining road, moving with the purposeful urgency that suggested they had been detected. "We need to get out of here," Frank said. But as they reached Miguel's pickup truck, they found their retreat blocked by two of the familiar black SUVs. Agent Webb emerged from the lead vehicle. His expression showing none of the professional courtesy that had characterized their previous encounters. "Mr. Morrison, you're in a restricted area." Frank felt anger replacing the fear that had initially gripped him. "This is my land. These are my mining claims. There are no restricted areas on my own property." Agent Webb gestured toward the concealed entrance they had just discovered. "Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Under the Defense Production Act warrant, certain areas of your ranch have been designated as critical infrastructure, requiring enhanced security measures. You've built some kind of facility inside my mountain without my knowledge or consent. We've established a monitoring station to track seismic activity and mineral composition in real time. The data we're collecting is essential to understanding the full extent of the rare earth deposit and its potential strategic value." Frank realized that the scope of the operation far exceeded anything Agent Webb had previously revealed. This wasn't simply about geological surveys or animal monitoring. They had constructed a permanent installation on his property that transformed his family's ranch into a military-industrial complex. Miguel moved closer to Frank's side, his loyalty absolute despite the obvious danger their discovery had created. The foreman had worked for the Morrison family for 20 years, had helped Frank through the hardest periods of ranch management, and clearly understood that this confrontation represented something far more significant than a dispute over mineral Writes. Agent Cole joined them, carrying a tablet computer that she activated with obvious reluctance. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to show you something that might help you understand why this operation is necessary. The screen displayed a map of North America with various colored regions indicating mineral deposits, strategic installations, and supply chain vulnerabilities. Frank could see immediately that his ranch occupied a critical position in a larger pattern of resource distribution that extended across multiple states. The rare earth deposits beneath your land are part of a much larger formation that could supply American defense contractors for the next 50 years. Agent Cole explained. But accessing those resources requires precise understanding of geological conditions, environmental factors, and extraction methodologies. And you couldn't accomplish that through normal legal channels? Agent Webb's expression hardened. Mr. Morrison, normal legal channels take years and involve environmental impact studies, community input processes, and political negotiations. That could delay or prevent access to resources that are critical to national security. We don't have years. Frank began to understand that his family's ranch had become a pawn in conflicts that extended far beyond individual property rights or local concerns. The facility hidden inside his mountain represented an investment of resources and technology that could only be justified by stakes much higher than anything he had previously imagined. What aren't you telling me? Agent Cole exchanged glances with Agent Webb, then turned back to Frank with an expression that might have been genuine regret. Mr. Morrison, intelligence reports indicate that foreign governments are actively working to secure control over rare earth mineral supplies that could give them leverage over American defense capabilities. The deposits beneath your ranch may be one of the last opportunities to maintain strategic independence in critical materials. The explanation transformed Frank's understanding of everything that had occurred over the past week. This wasn't about bureaucratic overreach or environmental research. It was about a resource war being fought on American soil, with his family's property serving as a battlefield in conflicts that most citizens would never know existed. Miguel spoke for the first time since the agent's arrival, his voice carrying the careful respect he always showed in serious situations. Senator Frank, I think we should leave now. Frank nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Miguel's suggestion. They had learned enough to understand that resistance would be futile and potentially dangerous. The people they were dealing with operated according to rules that placed national security considerations far above individual rights or constitutional protections. As they walked back toward Miguel's truck, Agent Webb called after them. Mr. Morrison, I hope you understand that what you've seen here today is classified information that cannot be shared with anyone. The security of the installation depends on maintaining operational secrecy. Frank turned back toward the agent, feeling the full weight of how completely his world had been transformed by forces beyond his control. Agent Webb, I think we both know that my understanding doesn't matter very much in this situation. The drive back to the ranch house took place in heavy silence, both men processing the implications of what they had discovered. Frank's property had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A resource extraction site disguised as a family ranch, with monitoring installations that represented technology and capabilities he couldn't begin to comprehend as they approached. The ranch buildings, Frank could see Margaret waiting on the front porch, her expression showing the kind of worried anticipation that had become too familiar over the past week. He would have to tell her about the facility hidden in their mountain, about the realization that their entire way of life had become subordinate to strategic considerations that rendered their individual wishes irrelevant. The Morrison Ranch would continue to exist, but it would never again be simply a family business focused on raising cattle and working the land. It had become something else entirely, a strategic asset in conflicts that extended far beyond the Wyoming high country, managed by people whose names Frank would never know and whose ultimate objectives remained hidden behind layers of classification and institutional secrecy. The revelation about the hidden facility marked a turning point in Frank's understanding of his situation, but it also crystallized a determination that had been building since Dakota's collapse a week earlier. That evening, as Margaret listened to his account of the discovery with growing alarm, Frank made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. "We're not going to let them turn our ranch into a military installation without a fight," he said, his voice carrying the quiet resolve that Margaret had learned to recognize as unshakable. Determination. Margaret reached across the kitchen table and took his hands in hers. "Frank, these people have resources we can't compete with. They've already shown they can do whatever they want on our property. Maybe so. But Jack was right about one thing. If they're operating outside proper legal channels, there are people in government who have the authority to stop them. We just need to get evidence to the right individuals." Frank's plan began to take shape over the next 2 days, built around the understanding that direct confrontation would be futile, but that documentation and exposure might provide the leverage needed to protect their interests. His cousin Jack had provided contacts within the Inspector General's office and congressional oversight committees, people whose job was to investigate federal overreach and abuse of authority. Miguel proved to be an unexpected ally in gathering evidence. His years of work on the ranch had given him an intimate knowledge of the property's remote areas, and his natural caution around authority figures made him an ideal scout for monitoring the government operation without being detected. They have regular supply runs every Tuesday and Friday, Miguel reported during one of their clandestine planning sessions in the ranch's equipment barn. Trucks come up the mining road after dark, stay for about 3 hours, then leave before dawn. Frank had purchased a trail camera designed for wildlife monitoring, but it proved equally effective for documenting the movements of federal agents. Positioned carefully among the pine trees that bordered the mining road, the camera captured images of vehicles, license plates, and personnel that could provide crucial evidence of the installation's scope and purpose. Dr. Chen became an unwitting source of additional information when Frank brought Dakota in for a follow-up examination. Her professional curiosity about the electromagnetic treatment had led her to research similar procedures, and she had discovered that the technology described by Dr. Morrison didn't match any legitimate veterinary applications. "Frank, I've been thinking about Dakota's treatment," she said during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. "The equipment they used looked more military than medical, and the recovery rate was unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of practice." Frank chose his words carefully, mindful of Agent Webb's warnings about confidentiality. "What do you think really happened?" Dr. Chun hesitated, clearly struggling with professional and ethical considerations. "I think someone used Dakota as a test subject for some kind of experimental technology, and when it malfunctioned, they covered it up by making it look like a legitimate medical treatment." The conversation provided Frank with additional confirmation that his family had been victimized by an operation that extended far beyond legitimate government authority. Dr. Chun's professional opinion could provide crucial credibility if Frank needed to present evidence to oversight investigators. Frank's most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source, his neighbor Tom Bradley. Despite their historical differences over grazing rights and water access, Tom approached Frank with information that shed new light on the regional scope of the government operation. "Frank, I've been having some strange experiences on my property," Tom said during a conversation at the feed store in Willow Creek. "Government people asking questions about mineral rights, aerial surveys that nobody authorized, equipment being moved around in areas where it doesn't belong." Frank realized that the rare earth deposits probably extended beyond his ranch boundaries, making Tom's sheep operation another potential target for federal acquisition or control. The knowledge that he wasn't alone in facing government pressure provided both comfort and additional cause for concern. What did you tell them? Same thing I'm telling you. My family has owned that land for 4 generations, and no federal agency is going to take it away from us without a fight. Frank found himself in the unusual position of allying with a neighbor he had barely spoken to in 20 years, united by shared threats to their property rights and way of life. Tom's military background: he had served 2 tours in Vietnam as an infantry sergeant, provided additional expertise in planning what was essentially a reconnaissance mission against a sophisticated adversary. The 2 men spent an evening studying topographical maps of the area, identifying observation points that would allow them to monitor the government facility without being detected. Tom's knowledge of military tactics and Frank's familiarity with the terrain created a combination of skills that neither man possessed individually. The key is to document their operations without giving them any reason to escalate their response, Tom explained. We need evidence that will stand up in court or congressional hearings, but we can't afford to provoke them into taking more direct action against our properties. Frank's plan called for a coordinated effort to gather photographic evidence, document vehicle movements, and identify personnel involved in the operation. The information would be compiled into a comprehensive report that could be presented to oversight authorities with the credibility needed to trigger an official investigation. Margaret initially opposed the plan, arguing that the risks outweighed any potential benefits. Frank, if these people are willing to perform surgery on your horse without your knowledge, what do you think they'll do if they catch you spying on their installation? If we don't try to stop them now, we'll spend the rest of our lives as tenants on our own property, Frank replied. I'd rather take the risk than surrender everything our family has built. The conversation revealed the fundamental choice that Frank faced: accept the transformation of his ranch into a government facility or risk everything in an attempt to preserve his family's independence. Margaret's concerns were entirely reasonable, but Frank had reached the point where compromise felt like capitulation. Miguel's wife, Rosa, added an unexpected dimension to their planning when she revealed that her brother worked for a trucking company that had been contracted to transport equipment to various government facilities in the region. Through careful questioning, Rosa learned that the Morrison Ranch was one of several locations in Wyoming and Colorado where similar installations were being constructed. They're building a whole network, Rosa reported during a family dinner that had become an impromptu strategy session. My brother says the contracts are worth millions of dollars, and they're all classified under national security provisions, the information confirmed Frank's growing suspicion that his ranch was part of a much larger operation that extended across multiple states. The rare earth mineral deposits formed a regional pattern that required coordinated extraction and monitoring, transforming the entire area into a strategic resource zone under federal control. Frank's documentation efforts intensified over the following week. The trail camera provided regular images of government vehicles, personnel rotations, and equipment deliveries that painted a picture of an operation far more extensive than anything Agent Webb had described. The facility appeared to operate on a 24-hour schedule, with activities that suggested both research and production capabilities. Tom Bradley's contribution proved equally valuable. His military experience allowed him to identify vehicle types, equipment categories, and personnel classifications that revealed the true nature of the installation. Many of the vehicles carried markings indicating Department of Defense rather than Department of Agriculture, suggesting that the operations command structure extended well beyond civilian agencies. This isn't a geological survey, Tom concluded, after reviewing Frank's photographic evidence. This is a military extraction facility designed to process strategic minerals for defense applications. The distinction was crucial for Frank's legal strategy. Geological surveys fell under established government authorities that were difficult to challenge, but military installations on private property without proper compensation or legal process violated constitutional protections that even national security considerations couldn't override. Frank's most dangerous reconnaissance mission took place on a moonless Thursday night in late October. Working with Tom as backup and communication support, Frank approached the concealed entrance to the facility, armed with a high-resolution camera and recording equipment borrowed from his cousin Jack's collection of intelligence-gathering tools. The hidden entrance was guarded by sophisticated electronic surveillance that Frank had learned to recognize and avoid through careful observation of patrol patterns. The facility's security relied heavily on technology rather than human guards, probably to minimize the number of personnel who knew about the installation's existence. Frank managed to photograph the entrance, document the electronic security systems, and record the sounds of heavy machinery operating deep inside the mountain. The audio evidence suggested industrial-scale operations that went far beyond simple monitoring or research activities. As he retreated from the surveillance position, Frank encountered an unexpected complication. Agent Cole emerging from the tree line with two armed companions. The federal agents had apparently detected his presence, despite his careful planning, and were now positioned to intercept his withdrawal. "Mr. Morrison, I think we need to have another conversation," Agent Cole said, her voice carrying a new edge of authority that hadn't been present in their previous encounters. Frank realized that his documentation effort had been discovered at the worst possible moment, when he was carrying evidence that could prove the existence of the illegal installation, but was too far from help to escape federal custody. The careful planning that had brought him this close to exposing the operation might also have delivered him directly into the hands of the people he was trying to investigate. The next few minutes would determine whether Frank's evidence reached the oversight authorities who could investigate the operation, or whether it disappeared along with Frank himself into the kind of federal detention that left no official records and generated no public accountability. Tom Bradley's voice crackled over the radio communication system they had established. "Frank, I see vehicles moving toward your position from 3 directions. You need to get out of there now." Frank weighed his options as Agent Cole's companions moved to flank his position. He could surrender the evidence and hope that cooperation would limit the consequences of his investigation. Or he could attempt to escape with information that might be the only proof of what the federal government was doing to private property owners throughout the region. Margaret's words from their kitchen table conversation echoed in his mind. Either you own your land or you don't. Either you have rights that can't be violated or you don't. Frank Morrison had spent 62 years believing in the fundamental principles that distinguished America from countries where governments could seize private property without legal process or constitutional protection. Tonight, in the Wyoming mountains under a star-filled sky, he would discover whether those principles still meant anything when they conflicted with national security considerations that most citizens would never understand. The decision he made in the next few seconds would determine not only his own fate, but whether his family's ranch would remain a symbol of independent American farming or become another strategic asset in a resource war that transformed private citizens into reluctant participants in conflicts they had never chosen to join. Frank's mind raced through his limited options as Agent Cole's armed companions positioned themselves to cut off his escape routes. The radio communication with Tom Bradley had gone silent, suggesting that the federal agents were using electronic jamming equipment to prevent coordination with his backup support. The camera and recording equipment in Frank's jacket contained evidence that could expose the illegal installation, but only if he could get it to the oversight authorities his cousin Jack had identified. Surrender would mean the evidence disappeared and the operation continued indefinitely, transforming his family's ranch into a permanent military facility without legal recourse. Agent Cole stepped closer, her expression showing none of the professional courtesy that had characterized their earlier encounters. "Mr. Morrison, You're interfering with a classified national security operation. I strongly advise you to cooperate fully and avoid making this situation more complicated than it needs to be." Frank realized that Agent Cole's tone had shifted from persuasion to intimidation, suggesting that his investigation had crossed a threshold that triggered more aggressive responses. The federal agents were no longer pretending that cooperation was voluntary. They were prepared to use whatever force was necessary to protect their operation. "Agent Cole, this is still my property. I have the right to be here." Actually, that's not entirely accurate. The Defense Production Act warrant grants us exclusive jurisdiction over areas designated as critical infrastructure. Your presence here constitutes trespassing on federal security installations. Frank felt the legal ground shifting beneath his feet as Agent Cole redefined his family's property according to federal authorities that seemed to override constitutional protections. The same land that had belonged to the Morrison family for 3 generations was now classified as a government facility where his presence required federal permission. One of Agent Cole's companions activated a powerful flashlight that illuminated Frank's position while temporarily blinding him to their movements. The tactical sophistication suggested military training rather than civilian law enforcement, reinforcing Frank's growing understanding that he was dealing with personnel whose capabilities extended far beyond normal federal agencies. "We're going to need you to hand over any recording or photographic equipment you might be carrying," Agent Cole continued. "And then we'll escort you back to your ranch house for a conversation about maintaining operational security." Frank's hands moved toward the camera equipment, but instead of surrendering it, he activated the wireless transmission feature that his cousin Jack had installed. The device began uploading the evening's photographs and recordings to a secure server that Jack maintained for exactly these circumstances. The transmission would take several minutes to complete, requiring Frank to delay the federal agents without revealing what he was doing. He needed to buy time while appearing to cooperate with their demands. "Agent Cole, before I hand over this equipment, I want to understand what's going to happen to my family if we continue to cooperate with your operation." Agent Cole's expression showed impatience, but she seemed willing to engage in conversation that might lead to Frank's voluntary surrender of the evidence. "Mr. Morrison, your cooperation ensures that your family can continue living on the ranch and operating your cattle business. Non-cooperation would force us to consider alternative arrangements that might be less comfortable for everyone involved." The threat was clear: comply or face displacement from land that had been in Frank's family for 3 generations. The federal government's ability to redefine private property as strategic infrastructure meant that resistance could result in total loss of everything the Morrison family had built over nearly a century of hard work. Frank's radio crackled with Tom Bradley's voice despite the electronic jamming. "Frank, I've got federal reinforcements moving up the mining road. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do it now." Agent Cole's head snapped toward the sound of the radio communication, her expression shifting to one of alarm. The presence of additional personnel suggested that Frank's investigation was part of a coordinated effort that extended beyond individual trespassing into organized resistance against federal authority. "Who else is involved in your surveillance activities?" Agent Cole demanded. Frank realized that his answer could determine whether Tom Bradley and his other allies faced the same federal pressure that was being applied to his family. The operation's security depended on limiting the number of people who knew about the installation's existence, making any organized resistance a significant threat to their continued secrecy. The camera equipment's transmission indicator showed that the upload was 60% complete. Frank needed to maintain the conversation for another 2 minutes to ensure that the evidence reached Jack's secure server, where it could be forwarded to oversight authorities regardless of what happened to Frank himself. "Agent Cole, I think you're overestimating the threat my neighbors represent to your operation." We're ranchers, not foreign agents or domestic terrorists. Mr. Morrison, any unauthorized surveillance of classified installations constitutes a potential security breach that must be addressed according to federal protocols. The scope of our response depends on the scope of the security threat. Frank understood that Agent Cole was giving him an opportunity to minimize the consequences by limiting the apparent extent of organized resistance to federal authority. But protection of his allies would require surrendering evidence that might be the only proof of the government's illegal activities on private property throughout the region. The camera equipment's transmission indicator reached 80% completion as Frank heard the sound of additional vehicles approaching through the forest. Agent Cole's reinforcements were arriving faster than expected, potentially cutting short the time he needed to complete the evidence upload. Frank made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. Instead of surrendering the equipment and hoping for governmental mercy, he activated the emergency beacon the Jack had provided for exactly this situation, a device that would alert congressional oversight, staffed to a federal emergency requiring immediate investigation. Agent Cole's expression changed dramatically as her equipment detected the beacon's transmission. Mr. Morrison, you're making a serious mistake. Interference with classified operations can result in charges that carry decades of federal prison time. Agent Cole, illegal surveillance of American citizens and seizure of private property without due process are also serious matters, I think. Congressional investigators should determine which of us is violating federal law. The transmission indicator showed 90% completion. Frank needed 30 more seconds to ensure that all evidence reached a secure server. But Agent Cole's companions were moving closer with weapons drawn and expressions that suggested their patience was exhausted. Tom Bradley's voice crackled over the radio one final time. Frank, get down now. The sound of rifle fire echoed across the mountainside as Tom's military training asserted itself in protection of his ally. Frank threw himself behind a fallen log as Agent Cole and her companions sought cover, their tactical formation disrupted by unexpected resistance from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Frank's transmission completed just as the firefight began in earnest. The evidence of illegal federal installations was now beyond the reach of Agent Cole's operation, safely uploaded to servers that would automatically forward the information to oversight authorities if Jack didn't check in within 24 hours. Tom Bradley appeared through the trees, moving with the practiced efficiency of a combat veteran who had faced far more dangerous situations in Vietnam. His presence transformed the confrontation from federal agents apprehending a trespasser into armed conflict between citizens and government forces on American soil. Frank, we need to move, Tom called out. I've got vehicles surrounding the area, but there's still a window to get out through the creek bed. Frank realized that Tom had planned for exactly this contingency, developing escape routes and tactical responses that drew on military experience gained decades earlier in Southeast Asian jungles. The sheep rancher who Frank had barely known was revealing himself as a formidable ally with skills perfectly suited to their current predicament. Agent Cole's voice carried across the clearing as federal reinforcements arrived. Mr. Bradley, you're engaging federal agents in the performance of their duties. Stand down immediately or face charges of assaulting federal officers. Tom's response demonstrated the kind of moral clarity that Frank had been searching for throughout the week of federal pressure and legal intimidation. Agent Cole, you're operating an illegal installation on private property without constitutional authority. Stand down immediately or face exposure to congressional oversight. The confrontation had transformed from a dispute over property rights into a fundamental test of whether federal agencies could operate beyond constitutional constraints. When national security was invoked as justification, Frank found himself at the center of a conflict that represented broader tensions between individual rights and institutional authority that had been building for Decades. Frank and Tom reached the creek bed as federal agents moved to surround their position. The shallow water provided concealment and a route toward the ranch buildings where Margaret and Miguel were waiting with vehicles positioned for emergency evacuation. "Did you get the evidence out?" Tom asked as they moved through the darkness. "Uploaded to Jack's servers. Congressional oversight will have everything within hours." Tom nodded grimly. "Then we've accomplished what we came to do. Now we need to survive long enough for the investigators to act on what you've provided." The sound of helicopters approaching from the south indicated that the federal response was escalating beyond anything Frank had anticipated. Agent Cole's operation was deploying resources that suggested military rather than civilian authority, transforming a rural Wyoming ranch into a battlefield in conflicts that most Americans would never know existed. Frank's cell phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jack, whose voice carried the urgency of someone who had received and reviewed the uploaded evidence. "Frank, I forwarded everything to Senator Richardson's oversight staff. They're demanding immediate congressional hearings on unauthorized federal installations on private property." "Jack, we may not survive long enough for congressional hearings to matter." "Frank, you've done something incredible. This evidence documents the most extensive violation of property rights since the internment camps. Hold your position for 6 more hours. Help is coming." Frank looked back toward the mining road where federal vehicles continued to arrive, their headlights creating an armed perimeter around his family's ranch. 6 hours seemed like an eternity when facing opponents with unlimited resources and legal authority that appeared to override constitutional protections. But for the first time since Dakota's collapse 8 days earlier, Frank felt that he was fighting for something larger than his individual property rights. The evidence he had risked everything to gather might protect not only his family's ranch, but hundreds of other properties throughout the region where federal agencies were seizing private land under the pretense of national security. 6 months later, Frank Morrison stood on his front porch watching Dakota graze in the paddock where the horse's collapse had started a chain of events that none of them could have imagined. The quarter horse showed no lasting effects from his ordeal, moving with the same sure-footed confidence that had characterized him for 15 years. The Morrison ranch looked much the same as it had before Agent Webb's first visit, but fundamental changes had occurred that went far beyond surface appearances. The hidden facility in the mountain had been sealed and abandoned following congressional hearings that exposed the scope of federal overreach in rural communities. Throughout the American West. Senator Richardson's Oversight Committee had issued a scathing report documenting unauthorized installations on private property in 12 states, involving millions of dollars in federal resources and violations of constitutional protections that extended back several years. The rare earth mineral deposits remained beneath Frank's land, but any future extraction would require proper legal procedures, environmental impact studies, and fair compensation to property owners. Agent Webb and Agent Cole had disappeared into the bureaucratic maze that protected federal employees from accountability. But their immediate superiors faced congressional censure and budget restrictions that effectively ended the covert installation program. Dr. Morrison, whose real name was never revealed, had been transferred to unspecified duties that removed him from operations involving civilian animals. Frank's evidence had proved crucial in establishing the pattern of federal abuse that gave congressional investigators the authority to demand full disclosure and institutional reform. The photographs and recordings from that dangerous October night had been featured in national news reports that brought public attention to issues that most Americans had never considered. Margaret emerged from the kitchen carrying the same coffee and breakfast she had prepared every morning for 35 years. But their conversation now included topics that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Congressional staff members called regularly for updates on ranch conditions, and investigative journalists visited periodically to document the long-term effects of federal surveillance on rural communities. Any word from Jack about the compensation? Hearings? Margaret asked, settling into her familiar rocking chair. Frank nodded toward a letter that had arrived the previous day. The Justice Department is offering a settlement that would cover all our expenses plus damages for the unauthorized use of our property. Tom Bradley got a similar offer for his land. The financial settlement would ensure the ranch's future security. But Frank had learned that some violations couldn't be measured in monetary terms. The knowledge that federal agencies could redefine private property as strategic infrastructure, according to authorities that most citizens didn't understand, had changed his fundamental assumptions about individual rights and governmental limitations. Miguel approached from the barn, his morning routine unchanged despite everything they had experienced together. The foreman had been recognized by Senator Richardson's committee as a crucial witness whose observations helped establish the timeline of federal activities on the ranch. The new cattle arrived this morning, Miguel reported. 20 head of Angus heifers, good bloodlines, no strange equipment attached to any part of their bodies. The gentle humor reflected how their shared ordeal had strengthened bonds that had already been forged through 20 years of working together. Miguel's loyalty during the federal crisis had elevated his role from employee to family member in ways that would influence ranch operations for years to come. The doctor Chun stopped by during her weekly visit to check on Dakota's continued recovery. Her professional relationship with Frank had deepened into genuine friendship based on shared experiences that neither of them could discuss publicly due to ongoing security classifications. His neurological responses are completely normal, she reported after examining Dakota. Whatever they did to him, there don't appear to be any lasting effects. Frank ran his hand along Dakota's neck, feeling the familiar warmth of healthy muscle beneath the smooth coat. The horse nickered softly at his touch, a sound of greeting that carried the same trust and affection that had characterized their relationship for 15 years. Tom Bradley's pickup truck appeared on the ranch road, another regular visitor whose friendship had grown from their shared confrontation with federal authority. The former Vietnam veteran had become Frank's closest advisor on matters involving governmental oversight and legal protections for rural property owners. Any news from Washington? Frank asked as Tom joined them on the porch. Senator Richardson's staff called this morning. They want us to testify at hearings next month about long-term federal accountability measures. Apparently, our situation has become a case study for constitutional protections in national security operations. Frank considered the invitation with mixed feelings. Public testimony would ensure that their story contributed to reforms that might protect other property owners, but it would also maintain their involvement in political conflicts that extended far beyond ranch management concerns. As the sun climbed higher over the Bighorn Mountains, Frank reflected on how completely his understanding of American institutions had been transformed by events that began with a horse's mysterious limp. The quiet rancher who had avoided political involvement for 62 years had become an advocate for constitutional protections that he had previously taken for granted. Dakota wandered closer to the fence, drawn by the sound of familiar voices and the possibility of attention from the humans who defined his world. Frank walked down to the paddock, offering the apple he had saved from breakfast and receiving the gentle nuzzling that represented perfect trust between species. The Morrison ranch would continue as a family operation focused on raising cattle and working the land that had sustained 3 generations of honest labor. But it would also serve as a reminder that individual rights required constant vigilance to protect against institutional forces that operated according to rules that prioritize collective interests over personal freedoms. Margaret's voice carried across the ranch yard, calling Frank back to the house for a phone call from their attorney about the final details of the federal settlement. As he walked back toward the porch, Frank felt the profound satisfaction that comes from defending something worth preserving against forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of approaching winter and the promise of seasons that would continue regardless of human conflicts over the resources that lay beneath the surface of the land. Frank Morrison had learned that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible, and that individual courage could sometimes prevail against institutional authority when supported by the constitutional principles that distinguished America from countries where governments face no meaningful constraints on their power over private citizens.